There's nothing quite like the pain of being abandoned by the people who are supposed to love you most. 8-year-old Lila Morrison learned this heartbreaking lesson when she watched her entire family drive away, leaving her and her German Shepherd Max alone at her grandmother's house after the funeral. They took everything they wanted and left behind what they saw as worthless, a grieving child and her dog. But 50 years later, Lila has turned that same property into a beautiful animal rescue. She saved hundreds of lives and built something meaningful from the ashes of rejection. Then a lawyer shows up at her door with shocking news. Her grandmother left behind $13 million, hidden away and meant only for Lila. Now the same family who abandoned her suddenly wants back into her life. What will Lila do when the people who threw her away come crawling back for money? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn painted the Montana sky in shades of rose and gold, casting long shadows across the rolling pastures of Morrison Ranch. Lila Morrison, now 58, with silver threading through her auburn hair, moved with quiet purpose through the animal enclosures, her weathered hands gentle as she checked on each of her rescued charges. The morning air carried the sweet scent of hay and the soft sounds of animals stirring to life, a symphony that had been her companion for decades. Max, her German shepherd, padded alongside her with the careful gait of his advanced years. His muzzle had gone completely white, and his once sharp brown eyes had grown cloudy with cataracts, but his devotion remained unwavering. He was no longer the puppy who had comforted a grieving 8-year-old girl, but he was still her steadfast guardian, her link to a past that had shaped everything she'd become. "Morning, old friend," Lila murmured, running her fingers through his thick coat. Max leaned against her leg, a gesture of affection that had become their daily ritual. Together they made their rounds, through the sanctuary that had grown from a dream born of necessity into something that mattered to hundreds of animals and the community that supported them. The rescue center sprawled across 40 acres of the original family property, a testament to what could be built from the ruins of abandonment. Sturdy wooden fences enclosed pastures where horses with troubled pasts grazed peacefully alongside goats rescued from neglect. A series of well-maintained buildings housed dogs recovering from abuse, cats healing from trauma, and even a few exotic birds whose previous owners had discovered that caring for another living creature required more than good intentions. Lila paused at the horse paddock, watching as Thunder, a magnificent black stallion with scars from his racing days, nuzzled a gentle mare named Whisper, who had arrived half-starved just months ago. Their unlikely friendship always touched her heart, proof that healing and trust could bloom even in the most damaged souls. "You two are quite the pair," she said softly, offering each horse a carrot from the canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Thunder's velvet nose brushed her palm with surprising gentleness for such a powerful animal. When he'd first arrived 3 years ago, he wouldn't let anyone within 10 feet of him. Time, patience, and consistent care had worked their quiet magic. The crunch of gravel under tires drew her attention to the long driveway winding through the property. Dr. Sarah. Chen's familiar blue pickup truck appeared around the bend, right on schedule for their weekly veterinary rounds. Sarah had been more than just the rescue's veterinarian for the past 15 years. She'd become Lila's closest friend, perhaps her only real friend, though Lila would never admit to the loneliness that sometimes crept in during the quiet evening hours. "Morning. Sunshine," Sarah called out as she climbed from the truck, her medical bag in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. At 45, she possessed the kind of boundless energy that came from finding your true calling in life. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her scrubs were already dusty from an early morning emergency call at another ranch. "You're in a good mood today," Lila observed, accepting the coffee with genuine gratitude. Sarah had discovered years ago that Lila rarely remembered to eat breakfast, much less brew decent coffee. Mrs. Henderson's mare finally foaled. Healthy filly, picture perfect. Sarah's smile was radiant. Sometimes this job gives you exactly what you need when you need it most. They walked together toward the main barn, their comfortable friendship built on shared purpose and mutual respect. Sarah had never pressed Lila about her past, sensing the walls that surrounded certain topics like family and childhood. Instead, she'd earned Lila's trust through actions, showing up reliably, caring for the animals with the same devotion Lila did, and proving that some people could be counted on, even when others failed you. Mike Torres was already at work in the barn, mucking stalls with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood that the unglamorous tasks were just as important as the visible ones. At 62, he'd found his way to the rescue after retiring from a career in construction, bringing with him skilled hands and a heart that had been broken by his own family's rejection when he'd needed them most. He rarely spoke about his past, but Lila recognized the signs of someone who understood abandonment from the inside out. "Ladies," he nodded respectfully, pausing in his work. "That new dog we got yesterday, the German Shepherd mix, she's been whining for you all morning, Lila. Won't eat, won't settle down, just keeps watching the door." Lila's heart clenched. New arrivals often went through this phase, especially the ones who'd been given up by families. They waited for someone to come back for them, hope and confusion mingling in their expressive eyes. "I'll spend some extra time with her today." "What's her story?" "Family moved across the country, said they couldn't take her." Mike's voice carried a familiar edge of disgust. 8 years old, perfectly healthy. They just didn't want the inconvenience." Sarah and Lila exchanged glances. They'd heard variations of this story countless times. Families who treated living beings like disposable inconveniences when life got complicated. Each case still stung, still awakened memories that Lila preferred to keep buried deep. The barn held 12 stalls, each designed for maximum comfort and safety. Lila had learned through trial and error what animals needed to heal: space without isolation, routine without rigidity, and most importantly, the knowledge that someone cared enough to show up every single day. The wooden walls were painted a soothing green, and natural light streamed through skylights that Mike had installed with characteristic attention to detail. In the far stall, a beautiful German Shepherd mix pressed herself against the back wall, her golden coat dull with stress. Her brown eyes tracked every movement with the hypervigilance of an animal whose world had been turned upside down. Lila's heart recognized the expression immediately. It was the same look she'd seen in Max's eyes 50 years ago, the day they'd been left behind together. "Hey there, beautiful girl," Lila said softly, settling cross-legged on the straw just outside the stall door. She made no move to enter the space, understanding that trust had to be offered, not demanded. "I know everything feels scary right now. I know you're wondering if anyone's coming back for you." The dog's ears twitched forward slightly, responding to the gentle tone, even if the words meant nothing to her. Lila had learned long ago that animals understood emotion better than language, responding to the truth in a person's heart rather than the promises that came from their mouth. "I waited too. Once upon a time," Lila continued, her voice carrying the weight of memory. "Waited by a window, watching every car that came down the driveway, sure that someone would realize they'd made a mistake and come back for me." She paused, watching as the dog took a tentative step closer to the gate. "But you know what I learned? Sometimes the people who leave are doing you a favor. They're making room for the ones who are supposed to be in your life." Sarah had finished her examination of the horses and now stood quietly at the entrance to the barn, listening to Lila's soft monologue. She'd witnessed these moments before, Lila speaking to injured animals with a tenderness that suggested she was healing something in herself as much as she was helping them. It was beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. The rescue's main house sat at the heart of the property, a modest 2-story structure that had been Lila's grandmother's home and was now her own. The wraparound porch held a collection of mismatched chairs where volunteers sometimes gathered after long days, sharing stories and the kind of easy camaraderie that came from shared purpose. Wind chimes made from old horseshoes hung from the porch ceiling, creating gentle music when the Montana breeze stirred them to life. Inside, the house maintained the comfortable, lived-in feeling that comes from being truly inhabited rather than merely decorated. Grandmother's furniture remained exactly where it had always been, including the wooden rocking chair by the front window, where Lila still sat each evening, watching the sun set over the pastures while Max dozed at her feet. The kitchen served as the unofficial headquarters of the rescue operation. A large whiteboard on one wall tracked medical schedules, feeding requirements, and volunteer shifts. The old oak table that had been in the family for generations now served as a desk where Lila managed the endless paperwork that came with running a non-profit organization. Grant applications, veterinary records, adoption forms, and donation acknowledgements covered its scarred surface in organized piles that made sense only to her. Photographs lined the windowsill above the sink, pictures of successful adoptions, animals who'd found their forever homes, and the volunteers who'd made it all possible. Each image represented a life saved, a second chance given, a small victory against the cruelty and indifference that brought so many animals to her door. On difficult days, when the financial pressures mounted, or when she had to make the heartbreaking decision to end an animal's suffering, these pictures reminded her why the work mattered. The afternoon brought a steady stream of volunteers, each drawn to the rescue by their own reasons, but united in their commitment to the animals' welfare. There was Margaret, a retired teacher who read to the more nervous dogs to help them adjust to human voices. Tom, a college student studying veterinary medicine, who gained hands-on experience while providing skilled labor. And dozens of others who showed up week after week, asking for nothing more than the satisfaction of making a difference. As the day wound down and the last volunteer headed home, Lila found herself in her usual spot on the front porch, watching the sky bleed from blue to orange to deep purple. Max settled beside her chair with a contented sigh, his breathing slow and steady in the peaceful evening air. This was her favorite time of day, when the work was done and the property settled into the quiet rhythms of evening. The land stretched out before them, 40 acres of rolling pasture and woodland that had been in the Morrison family for 4 generations. Her great-grandfather had homesteaded here, building the original house with his own hands and dreams of creating something that would last. Her grandfather had expanded the property, adding the big barn and the fencing that still enclosed the near pastures. Her father had modernized the house, installing electricity and indoor plumbing before he died too young in a farming accident that left her mother bitter and her grandmother heartbroken. And then there had been the day when everything changed, when 8-year-old Lila had learned that family didn't always mean what she thought it meant. The memories were still sharp after 50 years, the sound of car doors slamming, voices raised in argument over who would take what. The terrible silence that followed when they realized no one wanted the responsibility of a grieving child and her dog. But sitting here now, surrounded by the evidence of what she'd built from those ashes, Lila found she could remember without the old bitterness. The animals in her care had taught her something important about healing, that scars didn't disappear, but they didn't have to define you either. Like the horses who learned to trust again, or the dogs who found joy after abuse. She'd discovered that survival could become something beautiful if you were patient enough to let it grow. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky when she finally stood to go inside. Max rose with her, his movements careful but determined. Together, they made one final round through the buildings, checking that all was secure for the night. The new German Shepherd mix had finally eaten her dinner, Lila noted with satisfaction. Small victories were still victories. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new animals needing care, new paperwork to complete, and new volunteers to train. But tonight, as she settled into her grandmother's rocking chair with a cup of tea and Max at her feet, Lila Morrison felt the deep satisfaction that came from a life lived with purpose. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow would bring a visitor who would turn her carefully ordered world completely upside down. The black sedan looked out of place, winding up the gravel drive, its polished surface catching the morning sunlight like a mirror. Lila noticed it while distributing breakfast to the horses, pausing with a bucket of grain in her hands as she watched the unfamiliar vehicle approach. City cars rarely ventured this far into ranch country unless they were lost or bringing news that someone didn't want to hear. The man who emerged from the sedan wore a charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and he carried a leather briefcase with the kind of careful attention that suggested important contents. Everything about him spoke of law offices and serious business, the kind of formality that had no place among hay bales and animal enclosures. Max noticed the stranger too, positioning himself between Lila and the approaching man with protective instincts that age hadn't dimmed. His low growl was barely audible, more warning than threat, but clear enough in its meaning. "Miss Morrison?" The man's voice carried the measured tones of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. "I'm Jonathan Pierce from the law firm of Pierce, Harrison and Associates in Helena. I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I have some rather urgent business to discuss with you regarding your grandmother's estate." Lila set down the grain bucket slowly, her mind immediately suspicious. Grandmother had been dead for 50 years. What possible business could remain unsettled after all this time? "My grandmother's affairs were handled decades ago, Mr. Pierce. I'm afraid you've made some mistake." "I'm afraid there's no mistake, Miss Morrison. May we speak privately? What I have to share with you is quite sensitive and, frankly, rather extraordinary." He adjusted his glasses and glanced around at the rescue center with what might have been surprise. "I must say, this isn't quite what I expected to find here." Against her better judgment, Lila found herself leading him toward the front porch. The morning air carried the comfortable sounds of animals going about their routines. Horses nickering softly, dogs barking in the distance, the gentle lowing of cattle in the far pasture. These sounds had been the soundtrack to her life for so long that she barely noticed them. But they seemed to make the lawyer uncomfortable. "You've built quite an operation here," Pierce observed, settling into one of the mismatched porch chairs. "How long have you been running an animal rescue?" 23 years, Lila replied, remaining standing with her arms crossed. Something about this man set her on edge, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Maybe it was simply that people in expensive suits had a way of bringing complications into otherwise peaceful lives. "Mr. Pierce, I appreciate that you've driven all the way out here, but I'm quite busy and frankly confused about what business you could possibly have regarding my grandmother." Pierce opened his briefcase and withdrew a manila envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with red wax that bore an intricate stamp. "Your grandmother, Margaret Morrison, left specific instructions that this envelope was to be delivered to you on a particular date under very specific circumstances. Today is that date, and you've met those circumstances." Lila stared at the envelope as if it might contain a snake. "What circumstances?" "That you remained living on the family property, and that you demonstrated a consistent pattern of caring for animals in need." Pierce's expression grew almost admiring. "Your grandmother was quite specific about the signs I should look for. She predicted you would turn this place into some sort of sanctuary." The wax seal felt warm under Lila's fingertips as she accepted the envelope. Her grandmother's initials were pressed into the red wax, MEM, for Margaret Elizabeth Morrison, along with a small image of what looked like a key. The paper felt thick and expensive, the kind used for important documents that were meant to last. "How's that possible?" "Grandmother died when I was 8 years old. She couldn't have known what I'd do with my life. Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman, Miss Morrison. She understood people better than most, and she understood you in particular." Pierce withdrew a second item from his briefcase, an ornate brass key that looked like something from another era. Its head was decorated with intricate scrollwork, and its teeth were worn smooth by years of use. "This goes with the letter. She insisted they be delivered together." With trembling fingers, Lila broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. The paper was cream-colored and heavy, and the handwriting was unmistakably her grandmother's, the same careful script that had labeled recipe cards and written birthday wishes on cards that 8-year-old Lila had treasured. "My dearest Lila," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then 50 years have passed since I said goodbye to you in the hospital, and you have proven to be exactly the person I believed you would become. I am so very proud of you, my darling girl, and I hope you can forgive the deception that was necessary to protect what I'm about to share with you." Lila's hands began to shake as she continued reading. "The family that gathered after my funeral was not there to mourn me, as you have surely realized by now. They came for what they believed I had left behind, and they showed their true nature when they abandoned you and took only what seemed valuable to them. They never knew about the real treasure, because I hid it where only someone with your heart would ever find it." Pierce watched quietly as Lila's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been hope warring with old pain. "Over the past 50 years, the letter continued, I have been watching over you through arrangements I made before my death. The small trust fund that paid for your schooling, the anonymous donations that helped you start the rescue center, the grant money that always seemed to appear just when you needed it most. None of that was coincidence, my dear. I have been caring for you from beyond, just as you have been caring for God's creatures who had nowhere else to turn." "This is impossible," Lila whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. There had always been something mysterious about the way money had appeared when the rescue center desperately needed it. Anonymous donors who never wanted recognition, grants from foundations she'd never heard of, unexpected inheritances from strangers who claimed to have been touched by her work. The brass key in your possession opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Helena, box number 847. Inside that box, you will find documentation for accounts, investments, and properties that I have been accumulating in your name for the past 5 decades. The total value, as of the date this letter was written, should be approximately $13 million. The letter fluttered from Lila's nerveless fingers, landing on the porch floor where Max sniffed at it curiously. Pierce leaned forward, his expression kind but serious. "I should mention, Miss Morrison, that your family has already been notified of the inheritance. It was part of your grandmother's specific instructions. They should be contacting you quite soon. $13 million. Lila spoke the words as if they were in a foreign language. "That's not possible. Grandmother was comfortable, but she wasn't wealthy. The family took everything when she died: furniture, jewelry, the little bit of money she had saved. They took everything they could see," Pierce corrected gently. "Your grandmother was far more clever than they gave her credit for. She'd been quietly investing and saving for decades, but she hid her wealth because she'd seen what money did to people. She watched her own children become greedy and selfish, caring more about what they might inherit than about the woman who was supposed to leave it to them." Lila retrieved the letter with shaking hands and continued reading. "I know this news must come as a shock, but I hope you will understand why I chose this path. The people who abandoned you when you needed them most will now come to you asking for help. How you choose to respond will be entirely up to you, but I hope you will remember that forgiveness is not about forgetting what people have done. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of carrying their failures." The lawyer reached into his briefcase once more and produced a thick packet of legal documents. "There are conditions, of course. The inheritance is yours, free and clear, but your grandmother hoped you might consider establishing a foundation to continue the work you're already doing. She also left specific bequests for each member of your estranged family, but only if you choose to honor them." "What kind of bequests?" "Enough to solve their current financial problems, but not enough to make them wealthy. Your cousin Rebecca's husband needs expensive medical treatment that their insurance won't cover. Your Uncle Thomas is facing foreclosure on his home. Your Aunt Patricia has been struggling since her husband's death left her with significant debts." Pierce's expression grew thoughtful. "Your grandmother seemed to know exactly what each of them would be dealing with 50 years in the future." Lila stood abruptly and walked to the porch railing. staring out over the pastures where her rescued horses grazed peacefully in the morning sun. Everything she'd built here, every animal she'd saved, every volunteer she'd trained, had it all been possible because of her grandmother's secret generosity. "How long have you known about this?" she asked without turning around. "I've been the executor of this particular trust for 37 years, Miss Morrison. My father handled it before me and his partner before him. Your grandmother arranged for a legal firm that would outlast her by decades, ensuring that her wishes would be carried out precisely as she intended. And my family. They each received letters yesterday informing them of the inheritance and providing them with your current contact information." Pierce's tone grew cautious. "I expect you'll be hearing from them quite soon." As if summoned by his words, Lila's phone rang from inside the house. The sound echoed across the porch, seeming louder and more insistent than usual. She made no move to answer it, but Pierce raised his eyebrows questioningly. "That's probably them now," he said gently. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. This time, Lila walked inside and checked the caller ID. Rebecca Morrison Hayes. She'd changed her name when she married, but the number was listed in her grandmother's address book, a book that Lila had kept all these years without ever using. Miss Morrison. Pierce had followed her inside and now stood in the doorway. "You don't have to answer if you're not ready." But Lila was already reaching for the phone, some perverse curiosity driving her to hear the voice she hadn't heard in 50 years. "Hello, Rebecca, Lila? Oh my God, Lila, is it really you?" The voice on the other end was breathless with excitement and something that might have been desperation. "I can't believe I found you. I can't believe you're still there, still on the old property. I'm still here," Lila replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Listen, I know this must be strange, hearing from me after all these years, but I got this incredible letter from a lawyer and, well, I had to call. We need to talk, Lila, all of us. This is just unbelievable what grandmother apparently did. Can you believe she was sitting on $13 million all these years?" Pierce was watching Lila's face carefully, noting the way her jaw tightened at Rebecca's casual tone. 50 years of separation, and her cousin's first concern was the money. "It's a lot to process," Lila said carefully. "I'll bet it is. Listen, I'm driving down from Missoula tomorrow. Can I come see you? We have so much to catch up on, and there's so much to figure out about this inheritance. The lawyer said you're running some kind of animal shelter there now." "It's an animal rescue center, yes." "That's wonderful. I always knew you loved animals." Rebecca's laugh sounded forced. "So can I come visit? I'd love to see what you've done with the old place." Lila looked out the kitchen window at the peaceful scene beyond. Horses grazing, dogs playing in their runs, volunteers arriving for the afternoon shift. Tomorrow, all of this tranquility would be disrupted by people who had written her off 50 years ago, but now wanted to be part of her life again. "I'll be here," she said finally. "Wonderful. I'll see you tomorrow afternoon. And Lila, I'm so glad we're going to be a family again." The line went dead, leaving Lila staring at the phone in her hand. Pierce cleared his throat gently. "Miss Morrison, might I offer some advice? Take your time with any decisions. Your grandmother didn't create this situation to pressure you. She created it to give you choices. Whatever you decide, make sure it's what you truly want, not what others expect of you." After Pierce left, Lila sat in her grandmother's rocking chair with the letter in her lap and the brass key in her palm. Mac settled at her feet, sensing her distress. The phone had rung 6 more times. Calls from Uncle Thomas, Aunt Patricia, and more from Rebecca, but she'd let them all go to voicemail. $13 million. Enough money to expand the rescue center beyond her wildest dreams, to help animals across the entire state, to ensure that no creature in need would ever be turned away. But it also meant dealing with family members who had shown their true nature 50 years ago and were now apparently ready to pretend that abandonment had never happened. As the sun set over the Montana landscape, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Lila Morrison realized that tomorrow would change everything she'd built from the ashes of her childhood pain. The question was whether it would change it for the better or destroy the peace she'd worked so hard to create. Sleep had been elusive for Lila, her mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. She'd risen before dawn, finding solace in her familiar routines, even as everything else in her world felt uncertain. The animals seemed to sense her distress. The horses were more restless than usual, and even Max stayed closer to her side, his cloudy eyes watching her with the wisdom that comes from decades of shared experience. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived earlier than usual, her perceptive brown eyes immediately noting the tension in Lila's shoulders and the way she moved through her morning tasks with distracted efficiency. "You look like someone who's been wrestling with big decisions all night," Sarah observed, setting her medical bag down in the barn. "Want to talk about it?" Lila paused in her distribution of morning medications, a bottle of antibiotics for one of the horses clutched in her hand. In the 24 hours since Pierce's visit, she hadn't spoken to anyone about the inheritance or the family calls she'd been avoiding. The secret felt too big, too complicated to share. "I had an unexpected visitor yesterday. A lawyer." The words came out slowly, as if speaking them aloud made the whole situation more real. "He brought news about my grandmother's estate." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Your grandmother who died 50 years ago. Apparently she left some things unsettled, things that were meant to be revealed now under specific circumstances." Lila set down the medicine bottle and leaned against Thunder's stall door. The big stallion nickered softly and pushed his nose against her shoulder in a gesture of comfort that brought tears to her eyes. "What kind of things?" Before Lila could answer, the sound of another vehicle crunching up the gravel drive interrupted them. Through the barn's open doorway, they could see a dusty pickup truck with Washington state plates pulling up near the main house. The driver's door opened, and a woman emerged, tall, blonde, and carefully dressed in what passed for casual wear among people who'd never done a day of manual labor in their lives. Rebecca Morrison Hayes looked remarkably like she had at 28, the last time Lila had seen her. Her hair was shorter now and showed expensive highlights, but her features were unchanged. She moved with the kind of confident stride that came from a life where doors generally opened when you knocked on them. "That's my cousin Rebecca," Lila said quietly, watching through the barn door as Rebecca looked around the property with obvious surprise. "I haven't spoken to her in 50 years. Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "And now she's here the day after a lawyer brought you news about your grandmother's estate." Interesting timing. Max had noticed the stranger too, and his protective instincts kicked in. He positioned himself between Lila and the barn entrance, his hackles raised slightly, though he made no aggressive moves. Age had taught him patience, but it hadn't dimmed his ability to read situations that might threaten the person he'd spent his life protecting. "Lila?" Rebecca's voice carried across the yard, artificially bright with forced cheer. "Are you in there?" Lila exchanged glances with Sarah, then stepped out of the barn to face her past. Rebecca's smile was brilliant and seemed genuine, but there was something calculating in her eyes as she took in the scope of the rescue operation. "Rebecca," Lila's voice was carefully neutral. "You made good time from Missoula. I left early. I was too excited to sleep." Rebecca opened her arms as if expecting an embrace, but when Lila didn't move toward her, she let them fall awkwardly to her sides. "This place is amazing. Lila, I had no idea you'd built something so extensive. It's taken 23 years to get it to this point." 23 years. Rebecca shook her head in apparent wonder. "I can't believe it's been so long since we've talked. Time just gets away from you, doesn't it?" Sarah emerged from the barn, her presence a welcome buffer in what was already becoming an awkward conversation. Lila made introductions, grateful for her friend's steady presence. "Dr. Chen has been the rescue center's veterinarian for 15 years, Lila explained. "I couldn't do any of this without her expertise." "How wonderful," Rebecca said, though her attention was already wandering to the various buildings and enclosures that made up the rescue center. "This must be worth quite a bit of money, all this land and these facilities." Lila felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Within minutes of arriving, Rebecca was already calculating values and assessing assets. Some things apparently never changed. The land has been in the family for 4 generations, Lila replied. It's not about money. Of course not, Rebecca said quickly, though her expression suggested she didn't quite understand how anything could not be about money. But still, to have built all this from nothing, you must be very proud. I didn't build it from nothing. I built it from what was left behind when everyone else took what they wanted. The words hung in the air between them, sharp with old pain, and barely contained anger. Rebecca's smile faltered for the first time since her arrival. Lila, I hope we can talk about what happened back then. I know it must have been difficult for you, being so young and losing grandmother so suddenly. Difficult? Lila's voice rose slightly. I was 8 years old, Rebecca. 8. And after the funeral, everyone stood in this same yard and divided up grandmother's belongings like they were at a garage sale. Nobody wanted the responsibility of a grieving child and her dog, so they just left us here. Sarah stepped closer, her presence a silent reminder that Lila wasn't alone in facing this conversation. Rebecca looked genuinely uncomfortable now, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the guilt that flickered across her features. We were all grieving, Lila. We weren't thinking clearly. My mother had just lost her own mother, and Uncle Thomas was dealing with his own family problems. It wasn't that we didn't care about you. You didn't even say goodbye. The words came out flat and final. You loaded up your cars with anything that looked valuable and drove away. I stood in this driveway with Max and watched your taillights disappear. And not one of you looked back. I was only 28. Lila, I had my own children to think about, and my mother was falling apart. And I was 8. Lila's voice carried 50 years of accumulated pain. I was 8 years old, and I'd just lost the only person in the world who loved me unconditionally. But none of that mattered to any of you, did it? Rebecca's composure cracked completely. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, cutting tracks through her carefully applied foundation. You're right. We were terrible. I've regretted it every day for 50 years, but I didn't know how to fix it. How do you apologize for something that unforgivable? You don't, Lila replied. You live with the consequences of your choices, just like everyone else. Mike Torres had been working near enough to hear raised voices, and now he approached with the careful movements of someone who understood domestic conflicts. His weathered face showed concern as he took in the scene, Lila's rigid posture, Rebecca's tears, and the tension that crackled between them like electricity. Everything all right here? He asked quietly. Mike, this is my cousin Rebecca, Lila said, her voice regaining some of its composure. Rebecca, Mike Torres. He helps run the day-to-day operations here. Rebecca wiped her eyes and extended her hand to Mike, trying to regain her composure. It's nice to meet you. Lila's built something incredible here. Mike shook her hand politely, but his eyes remained watchful. In his years at the rescue center, he'd developed a protective instinct toward Lila that rivaled Max's. He'd seen too many people try to take advantage of her generous heart. She has, he agreed simply. Takes a special kind of person to dedicate their life to helping creatures that can't help themselves. The comment seemed innocent enough, but Rebecca caught the undertone. This man, like Dr. Chen, was clearly loyal to Lila and protective of her well-being. Would you like to see the facilities? Lila asked, falling back on the kind of polite hospitality that had been drilled into her by her grandmother decades ago. Since you've driven all this way. As they walked through the rescue center, Rebecca asked questions that revealed both genuine curiosity and a calculating mind, assessing the operation's scope and value. She admired the well-maintained buildings, exclaimed over the beautiful horses, and made appropriate sounds of sympathy when Lila explained each animal's backstory. But it was when they reached Lila's office in the main house that Rebecca's true purpose became clear. Her eyes immediately went to the desk, where stacks of unopened mail sat in neat piles, bills, grant applications, donation acknowledgements, and mixed among them several unopened letters that bore familiar handwriting. You kept all of grandmother's things exactly the same, Rebecca observed, running her fingers over the back of the wooden rocking chair. I remember sitting in this chair when I was little, listening to her tell stories about the old days. You remember that? Lila's voice carried a note of surprise. I remember a lot of things. I remember how patient she was with all of us kids, how she always had cookies in the jar and time to listen to our problems. Rebecca's voice grew soft with genuine nostalgia. I remember how much she loved you especially. You were always her favorite. If I was her favorite, why didn't any of you think she might have wanted me to stay in her house after she died? The question hung in the air, unanswerable and damning. Rebecca turned away from the rocking chair and noticed the stack of letters on the desk. You've gotten mail from the family over the years, she said. Recognizing her own handwriting on several envelopes, I never opened them. Never? Not even one. Lila shook her head. What was the point? You all made your choice 50 years ago. I made mine. Rebecca moved closer to the desk, her eyes scanning the postmarks on the letters. Lila, there are dozens of letters here. Christmas cards, birthday cards, wedding invitations, graduation announcements. I sent you pictures of my children when they were born. And I suppose you expected me to what? Send congratulations. Pretend we were a normal family that stayed in touch? I hoped, Rebecca said quietly. I hoped that someday you might forgive us enough to let us back into your life. Forgive you? Lila's laugh was bitter. Forgive you for what exactly? For abandoning an 8-year-old child. For treating me like an inconvenient piece of furniture that nobody wanted. For 50 years of silence until the moment you found out there was money involved. That's not fair, isn't it? Lila picked up one of the unopened letters, noting the return address and the date. This one's from 5 years ago. Uncle Thomas's handwriting. Want to guess when the last time was that any of you tried to contact me before the lawyer's letters went out? Rebecca was silent, her face flushed with shame and anger. The timing is quite a coincidence, don't you think? Lila continued. 50 years of nothing. And then, within 24 hours of learning about grandmother's inheritance, you're all suddenly desperate to reconnect with the family member you left behind. We didn't know how to reach out, Rebecca protested. We didn't know if you'd want to hear from us after so long, but you knew where to find me. You all knew I was still here, still on the property. If you'd really wanted to make amends, you could have done it any time in the last 50 years. Lila set the letter down carefully. The only thing that's changed is that now there's $13 million involved. The number hung between them like a challenge. Rebecca's eyes widened. Clearly, the lawyer's letter hadn't specified the exact amount, 13 million, she whispered. That's what the lawyer said. Money that grandmother apparently saved and invested over the years, hidden away so that people like you wouldn't know it existed. Rebecca sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her face pale with shock. I had no idea. The letter just said it was a substantial inheritance. $13 million. That changes everything, does it? Or does it just make your real motivations more obvious? Before Rebecca could answer, the phone rang. Lila glanced at the caller ID and saw another familiar name from her past. Thomas Morrison, her father's brother. That'll be Uncle Thomas, she said to Rebecca. Let me guess. He's driving down from Billings tomorrow to reconnect with his long-lost niece? Rebecca's silence was answer enough. Lila let the call go to voicemail, but the phone immediately started ringing again. This time it was Patricia Hendricks, her father's sister, calling from Great Falls. They're all coming, aren't they? Lila asked, like vultures circling a fresh kill. That's not fair, Lila. We're family. Family. Lila repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. Do you know what my family has been for the past 50 years, Rebecca? It's been Max, who stayed by my side when everyone else walked away. It's been Dr. Chen, who shows up every week whether I can pay her or not. It's been Mike Torres, who works harder than men half his age because he believes in what we're doing here. It's been hundreds of volunteers who give their time and energy because they care about something bigger than themselves. She gestured toward the window, where the afternoon shift of volunteers was arriving for work. Those people out there, they're my family. They chose to be here, chose to be part of something meaningful. They didn't show up because there was money involved. Rebecca was crying again, but this time her tears seemed more genuine, less calculated. "I know we don't deserve your forgiveness. I know we were selfish and cruel, and I know the timing of our sudden interest looks terrible. But Lila, some of us really have regretted what we did. Some of us really have wanted to make things right, have you?" Lila studied her cousin's face, looking for signs of sincerity beneath the perfectly applied makeup and expensive clothes. "Or have you just been feeling guilty about something you never bothered to fix?" "Both," Rebecca admitted. "I've carried the guilt for 50 years, but I was also too cowardly to face you. Every time I picked up the phone to call, I'd think about that little girl, standing in the driveway, watching us drive away, and I'd hang up without dialing. So, what's different now?" Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My husband is dying, Lila. He has cancer, and the treatments aren't covered by our insurance. We're losing everything trying to keep him alive. And I was desperate enough to hope that maybe, if there really was an inheritance, it might be enough to save him." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest, in a way that cut through 50 years of accumulated resentment. Lila felt her anger wavering, replaced by something she didn't want to acknowledge: compassion for the woman who had been part of her abandonment. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I'm sorry your husband is sick, thank you." Rebecca wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse. "I know it doesn't excuse the timing of my visit. I know it makes me look like exactly what you think I am, someone who only showed up because of the money. But I want you to know that I would have come eventually. I've been building up the courage for years." Outside, Max was barking at something in the distance, his deep voice carrying a note of alert rather than alarm. Through the kitchen window, Lila could see another unfamiliar vehicle making its way up the drive, a battered pickup truck with Montana plates. "Looks like Uncle Thomas couldn't wait until tomorrow after all," she observed. Rebecca followed her gaze and sighed. "He said he was coming down today. He's been struggling since Aunt Helen died last year. The medical bills wiped out their savings, and now he's facing foreclosure on the house. And Aunt Patricia, her husband left her with gambling debts she didn't know about. She's been working 2 jobs just to keep from losing everything." Lila absorbed this information, feeling the weight of family tragedies that had unfolded while she'd been building her life in isolation. "So you're all broke and you all need money, and suddenly you all remember that you have a niece you abandoned 50 years ago." "Yes," Rebecca said simply. "That's exactly what happened. And I know how terrible that makes us look, but sometimes desperation makes people brave enough to face things they've been too ashamed to deal with." The pickup truck had reached the house, and through its dusty windshield, Lila could see a man who looked much older than his 73 years. Uncle Thomas had been a robust rancher in his 40s, but the man climbing slowly out of the truck moved like someone carrying the weight of accumulated sorrows. Uncle Thomas Morrison looked like a man who had been worn down by decades of hard work and harder losses. His once powerful frame had shrunk with age and grief, and his weathered hands shook slightly as he removed his worn cowboy hat. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had betrayed him more than once. Each step measured against the possibility of pain. "Lila," he said simply as he reached the porch, his voice carrying the weight of years and unspoken regrets. "Thank you for letting me come." She hadn't exactly invited him, but there was something in his manner, a humility that Rebecca hadn't shown, that kept her from pointing that out. Instead, she found herself studying the man who had once been her father's closest brother, looking for traces of the person she remembered from her childhood, Uncle Thomas. The title felt strange on her tongue after 50 years of disuse. "You look tired." "I am tired," he admitted, settling heavily onto one of the porch chairs. "Too tired to pretend this isn't awkward as hell for all of us." Rebecca shot him a warning look, but he ignored it. Max approached cautiously, sniffing at the newcomer with the careful attention he paid to all strangers. To Lila's surprise, Thomas extended his hand slowly, palm up, allowing the old dog to investigate at his own pace. "You still have him?" Thomas observed, as Max cautiously accepted a gentle pat. "He was just a pup when we were here last. He's been with me through everything," Lila replied, noting the way Thomas's touch was respectful rather than presumptuous. "The only one who never left." The criticism hit its mark, but Thomas didn't flinch from it. "We did a terrible thing, Lila, all of us. There's no excuse for it, and I'm not going to waste your time trying to make one." His directness was unexpected. Rebecca had spent the past hour dancing around apologies and explanations, but Thomas seemed prepared to face the ugly truth head-on. "Then why are you here?" Lila asked. "Because I'm dying," he said matter-of-factly. "Cancer, same kind that took Helen last year. And because I've got maybe 6 months to try to make right the biggest mistake of my life before I meet my maker." Silence settled over the porch like a blanket. Even Rebecca seemed taken aback by her uncle's blunt honesty. "I'm sorry," Lila said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. "I'm sorry about Aunt Helen, and I'm sorry you're sick." "Thank you," Thomas continued, stroking Max's grey muzzle, his expression thoughtful. "Helen always said we should have come back for you. Every year, on the anniversary of Mother's death, she'd bring it up. 'We need to find Lila,' she'd say. 'We need to make this right.' But I was too proud and too ashamed to face what we'd done. And now?" Lila asked. "Now I'm dying, and pride seems like a luxury I can't afford." He looked up at her, his pale eyes direct and uncompromising. "I won't lie to you, Lila. I came here because that lawyer's letter mentioned money, and I need money. Helen's medical bills wiped us out, and my own treatment is going to cost more than we ever had. I'm facing the loss of everything my father and grandfather built." His honesty was brutal and somehow refreshing after Rebecca's emotional manipulations. There was something to be said for a man who could admit his desperation without dressing it up in pretty words. "But," Thomas continued, "I also came because I owe you an apology that's 50 years overdue. What we did to you was unforgivable. You were a child who had just lost everything, and we treated you like a piece of unwanted furniture. I've regretted it every day since. Have you?" Lila's voice carried a note of skepticism. "Because in 50 years, this is the first time you've bothered to tell me that. You're right. I was a coward. I told myself you were better off without us, that you'd found your own way, and didn't need reminders of how badly we'd failed you." He gestured toward the rescue center sprawling across the property. "Looks like I was right about you finding your own way anyway." "No thanks to any of you. No thanks to any of us," he agreed. "You did this in spite of us, not because of us." Dr. Chen had been watching the family reunion from the barn, her keen eyes noting the body language and dynamics between the 3 family members. Now she approached the porch with the confident stride of someone who had every right to be there. "Lila," she said, "I've finished the evening medical rounds. Thunder's wound is healing nicely, and the new German shepherd ate her full dinner for the first time since she arrived." It was a gentle reminder that Lila's real family, the chosen family of people who showed up every day, was still here, still watching out for her interests. Thomas noticed the subtle message and respected it. "You're the veterinarian," he said to Sarah. "Lila's lucky to have someone she can count on." "We count on each other," Sarah replied diplomatically. "That's how family works." The comment stung as it was meant to. Thomas nodded slowly, acknowledging the criticism without defensive anger. "Mom, would it be all right if I looked around the property?" he asked Lila. "I'd like to see what you've built here." Lila found herself nodding, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was curiosity about how her uncle would react to the sanctuary she'd created, or perhaps it was simply the desire to show him what had grown from the ashes of his abandonment. As they walked through the rescue center, Thomas asked practical questions about operations, funding, and logistics. His farming background made him genuinely interested in the infrastructure and systems that kept the operation running smoothly. "How many animals can you handle at capacity?" he asked, watching as a group of volunteers worked to repair fencing in one of the horse paddocks. "Right now, about 200, depending on the mix of species and their individual needs. We're always at capacity, though. For every animal we place in a good home, 3 more show up needing help." "Funding. Donations, grants, some government contracts for wildlife rehabilitation. It's always tight, always uncertain. Lila paused by the horse paddock, where Thunder and Whisper stood close together. The rescued stallion's protective instincts clearly focused on his gentle companion. These two arrived 6 months apart, both traumatized in their own ways. But they found each other and helped each other heal. Thomas studied the horses, perhaps hearing the metaphor beneath her words. They're beautiful animals. You've done good work here, Lila, better than good. You've done something meaningful. His praise surprised her with how much it mattered. She'd spent 50 years not caring what her family thought. But apparently, some part of her still craved their approval. They walked past the dog runs, where a dozen rescued animals greeted their approach with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The new German Shepherd mix that Mike had mentioned was there, still cautious, but showing signs of emerging from her shell. That's Luna, Lila explained. 8 years old, given up because her family was moving and didn't want the inconvenience. She's been waiting for someone to want her. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the dog's hopeful expression. How long do they usually wait? Some find homes quickly. Others wait months or even years. A few never leave. They become permanent residents, part of the family here. And you're okay with that? Caring for animals that might never find other homes. Lila looked at him sharply, wondering if there was criticism in the question, but his expression seemed genuinely curious. Someone has to, she said simply. If I don't, who will? They didn't choose to be abandoned. That was done to them by people who should have been more responsible. But they deserve safety and care, regardless of whether they're convenient or profitable. Thomas nodded slowly, and she could see him processing not just her words, but their implications. They were talking about more than just animals, and they both knew it. By the time they'd completed the circuit and returned to the house, the afternoon was fading into evening. Rebecca had remained on the porch, making phone calls that sounded suspiciously like conversations with other family members. When she saw them approaching, she ended her call quickly. Patricia's driving down from Great Falls tomorrow, she announced. She wanted to be here for whatever family meeting we end up having. Family meeting, Lila repeated dryly. Is that what we're calling this? What would you call it? Thomas asked. Lila considered the question seriously. 3 family members who had ignored her existence for 50 years, all arriving within days of learning about a substantial inheritance. Their motivations were transparent, their timing suspicious, and their sudden interest in reconciliation felt calculated rather than genuine. And yet, looking at Thomas's worn face and Rebecca's tear-stained makeup, she could see that their desperation was real. Whatever had brought them here, they were people in genuine need, carrying burdens that had grown too heavy to bear alone. I'd call it a reckoning, she said finally. A chance to decide what we're going to do with 50 years of hurt and anger and regret. And what do you want to do with it? Rebecca asked quietly. Lila looked around at the rescue center she'd built, at the animals who trusted her to keep them safe, at the volunteers who had chosen to be part of her mission. This place had been born from her childhood trauma, but it had grown into something beautiful and meaningful. The question was whether her family's return would enhance that mission or destroy it. I don't know yet, she admitted. But I guess we're going to find out. As the sun set over the Montana landscape, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, 3 estranged family members sat on the porch where their story had begun 50 years ago. The conversation was awkward and painful, filled with long silences and careful words, but it was happening. After 5 decades of separation, the Morrison family was talking again. Whether they could ever truly heal the wounds they'd inflicted on each other remained to be seen. But for the first time in 50 years, it seemed like a possibility worth exploring. The discovery happened by accident, as the most significant revelations often do. Lila had been searching for her grandmother's old recipe for apple butter, something she'd been meaning to recreate for years, but had never quite found the time. When she noticed that the wooden recipe box felt heavier than it should have, she'd inherited the small pine container along with everything else her family had deemed worthless. 50 years ago, it had sat on the kitchen counter through 5 decades of daily use, holding the handwritten cards that had guided her through learning to cook for herself and, later, for the volunteers who sometimes stayed through dinner. But today, as she lifted it to search for the apple butter recipe, something shifted inside with a sound that wasn't the familiar rustle of paper. Setting the box on the kitchen table, Lila opened it carefully and began removing recipe cards she'd memorized years ago. Pot roast, sugar cookies, bread pudding, dozens of others written in her grandmother's careful script. At the bottom of the box, beneath a layer of cards she rarely used, was something unexpected, a thin manila envelope taped to the wooden floor of the container. The envelope was yellowed with age and sealed, with "For Lila's Eyes Only" written across it in her grandmother's distinctive handwriting. With trembling fingers, Lila carefully removed the tape and opened the envelope. Inside were several sheets of paper, notes written in her grandmother's hand, but not recipes. These were observations, character sketches, and what could only be described as a careful analysis of every family member who had gathered for the funeral 50 years ago. Rebecca, the first page began, is her mother's daughter in all the worst ways. She sees everything in terms of what it can do for her, and her children are learning the same lesson. She'll come back for the money when she hears about it, full of tears and apologies, but it won't be genuine remorse. It'll be strategy. She's learned to weaponize emotions to get what she wants. Lila's breath caught as she read her grandmother's assessment. The woman had died when Rebecca was 28, but she'd apparently seen through her granddaughter's surface charm to something calculating beneath. The next page focused on Thomas. My son-in-law has a good heart, but he's weak. He lets fear and pride make his decisions instead of love and responsibility. When the crisis comes, and it will come, he'll choose the path that feels safest rather than the one that's right. He'll regret it for the rest of his life, but regret won't be enough to make him brave. Page after page contained similar observations, each family member dissected with the kind of brutal honesty that comes from loving people enough to see them clearly. Her grandmother had known exactly what would happen at the funeral, had predicted with uncanny accuracy how each person would behave when faced with the choice between convenience and responsibility. But it was the final page that made Lila sink into her kitchen chair, her heart pounding with a mixture of love and grief that threatened to overwhelm her. My dearest Lila, it read, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass, and my family has shown their true nature by abandoning you when you needed them most. I'm writing this while you sleep upstairs, 3 days before I will die, and my heart is breaking for what you are about to endure. I know what they will do. I've watched them my entire life, seen how they respond to inconvenience and responsibility. They will take what seems valuable and leave behind what seems burdensome. They don't understand that the most precious things in life can't be loaded into the back of a pickup truck. I have been preparing for this moment since you came to live with me 2 years ago. The money they know about, the savings account, the small investments, the household goods, all of that is a test. The real inheritance is hidden where only someone with your heart would ever find it. You see, my darling girl, I've been watching you care for injured birds and stray cats, watching you turn our barn into a hospital for creatures that others had given up on. I've seen how you gentle the most frightened animals with patience and love, how you never give up on something just because it's broken. That is who you are, Lila Morrison. That is who you will always be. And someday, when you've built something beautiful from the ashes they leave behind, you'll have the chance to show them what real love looks like. Not the conditional love they offered you, which disappeared the moment it became inconvenient, but the kind of love that chooses to stay even when staying is hard. Tears were streaming down Lila's face as she read her grandmother's final words, written with the prescience of someone who had lived long enough to understand human nature in all its complexity, the choice of what to do with them when they return, and they will return. My dear, When they learn about the real inheritance, that choice will be entirely yours. I hope you will remember that forgiveness is not about forgetting what people have done. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of carrying their failures. But forgiveness must be genuine, not performed, and it must be given freely, not extracted through guilt or manipulation. Whatever you choose, I will be proud of you. You are the best of all of us, the one who took the worst thing that could happen to a child and used it to develop the biggest heart I've ever known. Never let anyone make you smaller than you are, and never let anyone convince you that your capacity for love is a weakness, all my love. Always and forever, grandmother. Lila sat in the gathering dusk, her grandmother's words echoing in the quiet kitchen. Outside, she could hear the familiar sounds of the rescue center settling in for the night, horses nickering softly, dogs barking in the distance, the gentle sounds of animals who trusted that tomorrow would bring food and care and safety. From the living room came voices, Rebecca on another phone call with Patricia, Thomas watching the evening news with the volume turned low. They'd been at the property for 2 days now, and the initial awkwardness was beginning to give way to something more complex. Not comfort exactly, but a kind of wary familiarity. Rebecca had thrown herself into helping with the rescue center's operations, though her assistance often came with suggestions for improvements that sounded suspiciously like business propositions. She'd mentioned several times how much the property must be worth, how the rescue center could be scaled up with proper investment, how the right kind of marketing could turn the operation into a real moneymaker. Thomas, by contrast, had simply made himself useful. He'd repaired fencing without being asked, helped Mike with the heavier construction projects, and spent long periods sitting quietly with the more traumatized animals. His presence seemed to calm them in a way that surprised everyone, including Thomas himself. They remember, he'd told Lila that morning as he sat in Luna's run, the abandoned German shepherd finally allowing him to stroke her fur. Animals who've been hurt, they can tell when someone else knows what it feels like to be abandoned. It had been an unexpectedly perceptive comment from a man who'd spent most of his life working with livestock rather than companion animals. But then Thomas was proving to be more complex than Lila had expected. His blunt honesty about his motivations had been refreshing. But there were moments when she caught glimpses of genuine remorse in his expression, a grief that went deeper than fear of financial ruin. The kitchen phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Patricia Hendricks, calling from Great Falls. Lila. Patricia's voice carried the same artificial brightness that Rebecca had used, but underneath it was something sharper, more desperate. "I'm so glad you answered. I wasn't sure you would, Aunt Patricia." The title still felt strange. "Rebecca said you were planning to drive down tomorrow." "I am. But I wanted to talk to you first, privately. There are some things I need to explain before I see you face to face." Lila waited, noting the careful way her aunt was choosing her words. "I know how this must look," Patricia continued. "All of us showing up right after learning about Mother's inheritance. I know it seems like we're only interested in the money. Aren't you?" The direct question seemed to catch Patricia off guard. She was quiet for a moment before answering with her own brutal honesty. "Yes, God help me, yes, I am interested in the money. I'm drowning, Lila. I'm 68 years old, working 2 jobs just to keep from losing the house, and I'm still falling further behind every month." At least she was being honest about it. Lila found she respected that more than Rebecca's emotional manipulations. "But," Patricia continued, "I also need you to know that I've thought about you every day for 50 years. Every single day, I've wondered if you were okay, if you were happy, if you forgave us for what we did. And what conclusion did you reach? That we didn't deserve forgiveness. That we'd done something so fundamentally wrong that it couldn't be fixed with apologies or explanations." Patricia's voice grew thick with tears. "But I never stopped hoping that somehow, someday, I might have the chance to tell you how sorry I am." Lila closed her eyes, thinking about her grandmother's words about genuine versus performed forgiveness. How could she tell the difference? How could anyone? "I'll see you tomorrow, Aunt Patricia," she said finally. We'll talk then. After ending the call, Lila sat alone in the kitchen with her grandmother's hidden notes spread before her. 3 family members converging on her property, all of them carrying 50 years of regret and desperate financial need, all of them hoping for forgiveness they might not deserve and money they definitely needed, and at the center of it all, $13 million that could solve all their problems if she chose to let it. But her grandmother's final message was clear. The choice was hers alone. Not theirs to demand, not society's to expect, but hers to make freely and honestly. The question was whether she had the wisdom to make it well. Outside, Max barked once at something in the darkness, then settled with a contented sigh. Even in his old age, he was still watching over her, still faithful to the bond they'd formed 50 years ago when they'd been abandoned together. Some kinds of loyalty, Lila reflected, were earned through consistency rather than blood. Some kinds of family were chosen rather than inherited. And some kinds of love grew stronger through adversity rather than weaker through neglect. The question was whether any of those truths could bridge 50 years of abandonment and hurt. Tomorrow, when Patricia arrived, she would find out. Patricia Hendricks arrived at dawn, her battered Honda Civic coughing and wheezing as it climbed the long driveway. Through the kitchen window, Lila watched her aunt emerge from the car with the careful movements of someone whose body had been worn down by too many years of hard work and worry. At 68, Patricia looked older than her years, her grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and her clothes speaking of careful economy rather than style. The reunion on the front porch was subdued, lacking the theatrical tears that had marked Rebecca's arrival or the blunt honesty that had characterized Thomas's approach. Patricia simply stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of the niece she hadn't seen since childhood, her weathered hands clasped tightly together. "You look like your father," she said finally. "Same stubborn chin, same eyes that see more than you let on." Aunt Patricia. Lila's voice was carefully neutral, but she found herself studying the woman who had been her father's younger sister. Patricia had been 25 when the abandonment happened. Young enough to claim youth as an excuse, but old enough to know better. "I brought something for you," Patricia said, reaching into her car to retrieve a small wrapped package. "I've been carrying it around for 47 years, waiting for the chance to give it to you." Lila accepted the package hesitantly. The wrapping paper was faded and worn, clearly saved from some long-ago Christmas, and inside was something that made her breath catch, a child's drawing, carefully preserved behind glass in a simple frame. It was a crayon drawing of a family, stick figures, holding hands in front of a house, with "My Family" written across the top in a child's unsteady hand. Lila recognized her own 8-year-old artwork immediately, though she had no memory of creating it. "You drew this the Christmas before Grandmother got sick," Patricia explained quietly. "She had it on her refrigerator, and after the funeral I couldn't bear to leave it behind with everything else. I told myself I'd give it back to you someday. When I was brave enough to face what we'd done." Lila stared at the drawing, seeing herself at 8 years old, believing in the permanence of family love, innocently depicting the people who would abandon her just months later. The figures in the drawing were all holding hands, connected and secure in their unity. "Why now?" Lila asked, her voice thick with emotion she was trying to suppress. "Because I'm dying," Patricia said matter-of-factly. Not quickly like Thomas, but slowly. Diabetes, heart disease, arthritis, that makes every day a struggle. "I'm dying by inches, and I refuse to take this guilt with me to the grave." Her directness was reminiscent of Thomas's approach, but where his honesty had felt strategic, Patricia's felt like genuine desperation. This was a woman who had reached the end of her emotional resources and had nothing left but the truth. Rebecca and Thomas emerged from the house, drawn by the sound of voices. The sight of the 4 family members standing together on the porch would have seemed impossible just a week ago. But here they were, united by circumstance, if not by affection. "So we're all here now," Rebecca observed, her voice carrying a note of forced cheer. The whole Morrison family together again after 50 years. Are we? Lila asked, still clutching the framed drawing. A family, I mean. Or are we just four people who happen to share some DNA and a common interest in $13 million? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Patricia shifted uncomfortably. Thomas studied his boots, and Rebecca's carefully maintained smile faltered. That's what we need to figure out, Thomas said finally. What we are to each other, and what we want to be going forward. I know what I want, Rebecca said quickly. I want us to be a real family again. I want Sunday dinners and birthday parties and grandchildren who know their great-aunt Lila. I want to make up for 50 years of missing out on each other's lives. And the money? Lila asked. Rebecca flushed but didn't look away. And yes, I want the money too. I need the money. My husband is dying, and the treatments that might save him cost more than we'll ever have. I won't pretend that's not part of why I'm here. At least you're honest about it now, Patricia murmured. What about you, Aunt Patricia? What do you want? Patricia considered the question seriously. I want peace, Lila. I want to stop waking up every morning with the weight of what we did to you pressing on my chest. I want to look at myself in the mirror without feeling sick with shame. She paused, then added quietly, and I want to not lose my house, if I'm being completely honest. It's the only thing I have left of your Uncle Richard. Thomas nodded slowly. I want forgiveness that I don't deserve, and money that I desperately need, and the chance to spend whatever time I have left trying to be the kind of man I should have been 50 years ago. Their honesty was brutal and somehow refreshing. No more pretense. No more emotional manipulation, just four people acknowledging their failures and their needs with the kind of directness that might actually lead somewhere productive. Come inside, Lila said finally. I have something to show you. In the kitchen, she spread her grandmother's hidden notes across the table, watching as her family members read their own character assassinations with varying degrees of shock and recognition. Rebecca was the first to finish reading, her face pale with a mixture of anger and shame. She knew, she whispered. She knew exactly what we were going to do. Every word, Thomas agreed, setting down his page with shaking hands. She saw right through all of us. Patricia was crying as she read her own assessment, tears dropping onto the paper as she absorbed her mother's unflinching analysis of her weaknesses and failures. Listen to this, Lila said, picking up another sheet of paper. This one's about me, she read aloud from her grandmother's notes. Lila is 8 years old and has already experienced more loss than most adults ever will. Her parents are gone, and now I'm dying, and she will soon learn that the family she trusts to catch her when she falls will instead be the ones who push her down. But I've watched this child nurture wounded creatures back to health, and I've seen the depth of compassion in her heart. She will survive what's coming, and she will grow strong in the broken places. Someday, she will have the power to heal not just animals, but the family that failed her. The question is whether she will choose mercy or justice when that day comes. The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle ticking of the old clock on the wall and Patricia's quiet weeping. She planned all of this, Rebecca said finally. The inheritance, the conditions, bringing us back together, it was all part of some elaborate scheme. Not a scheme, Thomas corrected. A test. She wanted to see what kind of people we'd become, and what kind of person Lila would choose to be when faced with the choice between revenge and forgiveness. Lila moved to the window, looking out at the rescue center that had grown from the ashes of her childhood trauma. Animals moved peacefully through the pastures, volunteers arrived for their shifts, and the daily routines that defined her life continued unchanged despite the upheaval of family drama. I found something else, she said, retrieving another item from the recipe box, a small brass key that matched the one the lawyer had brought, but older and more worn. This was taped inside the lid. She held up the key, watching as it caught the morning light. There's an old trunk in Grandmother's bedroom. I've walked past it thousands of times over the years, but I never had a reason to open it. The trunk sat at the foot of the bed in what had been her grandmother's room, and was now Lila's own. It was made of dark wood with brass corners, the kind of chest that spoke of long journeys and carefully preserved memories. The lock was small but solid, and the old key turned in it with a soft click that seemed to echo with significance. Inside the trunk was a carefully organized collection of documents, photographs, and personal items that told the story of Margaret Morrison's secret life as a woman of substantial means. Bank statements going back decades, stock certificates, property deeds, and most surprising of all, a leather-bound journal that contained 50 years of entries. Lila opened the journal randomly and began reading aloud. June 15th, 1985. Lila graduated from high school today. I wasn't there to see it, of course. She doesn't know about the anonymous scholarship that paid her way, or the guidance counselor I hired to make sure she got the support she needed. She's going to study veterinary science in the fall. I always knew she would find a way to heal the world, one wounded creature at a time, Rebecca gasped. You paid for her education? Lila flipped through more pages, finding entry after entry, documenting her grandmother's secret involvement in her life. December 3rd, 1992, Lila used the insurance settlement from the barn fire to build proper veterinary facilities. She doesn't know that I arranged for that policy to be far more generous than standard coverage, or that the anonymous benefactor who matched her insurance payout dollar for dollar is the same person who made sure she never went hungry as a child. The pattern continued through decades of entries, anonymous donations that appeared at crucial moments, grants from foundations that were secretly funded by her grandmother's estate. Even the land purchases that had expanded the rescue center's capacity. Every major milestone in Lila's adult life had been quietly supported by the woman who had died when she was 8 years old. She never abandoned you at all, Patricia whispered, her voice filled with wonder and shame. She was watching over you the entire time, while the rest of us forgot you existed, Thomas added bitterly. But it was the final entry that brought tears to Lila's eyes. March 12, 2024. Lila turns 58 today. She has built something beautiful from the pain we caused her, something that honors the best parts of who she's always been. Tomorrow, the lawyers will begin the process that will bring her family back into her life. I pray she will find it in her heart to show them the kind of love they never showed her. Not because they deserve it, but because she does. She deserves the peace that comes from choosing mercy over bitterness, hope over hurt. Whatever she decides, I will be proud of her. She has been the greatest joy of my life, even from a distance. The journal entry was dated just 3 months ago, impossible but undeniable in its implications. Somehow, some way, her grandmother's love and protection had continued long past death, guided by plans made with supernatural foresight. How is any of this possible? Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Lila admitted, closing the journal carefully. But I know what it means. It means that even when I felt most alone, I wasn't. It means that love can transcend death and time and the failures of the people who are supposed to carry it forward. She looked at each of her family members in turn. Rebecca, with her calculated emotions and desperate need. Thomas, with his blunt honesty and terminal illness. Patricia, with her quiet shame and financial desperation. It also means, she continued slowly, that this moment, right here, right now, is exactly what grandmother planned for. She knew you would come back when you learned about the money. She knew I would have to choose between justice and mercy, between holding on to 50 years of hurt or finding a way to let it go. The afternoon sun was slanting through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the table, where the evidence of their family's complex history lay scattered. Outside, the rescue center continued its daily rhythms, animals healing from their own traumas, while the humans who cared for them worked through theirs. The question that remained was whether the Morrison family could find their own path to healing, or whether some wounds were too deep to ever truly close. The answer, Lila realized, would depend on choices that each of them would have to make in the hours and days to come. The second visit from Jonathan Pierce came exactly 30 days after the first, just as the lawyer had predicted. This time, however, His arrival felt less like an interruption and more like the culmination of something that had been building toward this moment for 50 years. Lila had been expecting him. The sealed instructions her grandmother had left were specific: 30 days to allow the family to reunite, to air their grievances, to begin the difficult work of rebuilding trust. 30 days to see whether healing was possible, or whether some wounds were too deep to ever close. Rebecca, Thomas, and Patricia had all remained on the property during those 30 days, sleeping in the guest rooms and slowly integrating themselves into the daily rhythms of the rescue center. It hadn't been easy. There had been arguments, tears, and moments when the weight of 50 years of hurt seemed too heavy to bear. But there had also been unexpected moments of connection, small victories that suggested forgiveness might be possible. Thomas had thrown himself into the physical work of maintaining the property, his farming background making him invaluable despite his illness. He'd repaired fences, maintained equipment, and spent countless hours sitting with the more traumatized animals, his quiet presence somehow comforting creatures who had learned not to trust human beings. Patricia had taken over much of the administrative work, her background in bookkeeping proving invaluable in managing the complex financial requirements of running a non-profit organization. She worked long hours without complaint, seeming to find peace in the routine tasks that kept the rescue center functioning. Rebecca had been the most difficult to integrate. Her instinct to see everything in terms of profit and loss made her contributions feel strategic rather than genuine. She'd suggested improvements that would increase revenue, proposed marketing strategies to attract more donations, and generally approached the rescue center as a business opportunity rather than a mission of compassion. But even Rebecca had her moments. Lila had found her one morning in the barn, crying over an injured owl that had been brought in the night before. The bird's wing was badly damaged, possibly beyond repair, and Rebecca had been sitting with it for hours, whispering encouragement and offering the kind of gentle comfort she'd never shown during her initial visit. Now, as Pierce's familiar black sedan made its way up the drive, all 4 family members gathered on the porch where their reunion had begun. The lawyer emerged from his car carrying a leather briefcase that looked identical to the one he'd brought a month earlier. But his expression was more serious, more formal. "Miss Morrison, family," he greeted them with professional courtesy. "I trust the past month has been illuminating." "That's one word for it," Thomas replied dryly. Pierce settled into the same porch chair he'd occupied during his first visit. But this time, he seemed to be conducting a formal proceeding rather than simply delivering information. "Your grandmother left very specific instructions for this meeting," he began, withdrawing a thick envelope from his briefcase. "She anticipated that you would need time to reconnect, to work through old grievances, and to determine whether reconciliation was possible. Today, we discover the results of her final test." He held up the envelope, which bore the same red wax seal that had marked the first letter, but with additional markings that suggested greater significance. "Before I open this, I must ask each of you a direct question, and I need honest answers. The contents of this envelope and the ultimate disposition of your grandmother's estate depend on your responses." Pierce turned to Lila first. "Miss Morrison, after 30 days with your estranged family, are you prepared to forgive them for abandoning you 50 years ago? Not forget, forgive. Are you willing to let go of the anger and hurt you've carried all these years, not because they deserve it, but because holding on to it serves no purpose?" Lila looked at each of her family members in turn. Rebecca, who had shown moments of genuine remorse between her calculated attempts at manipulation. Thomas, who had been unflinchingly honest about his motivations while throwing himself into the work of the rescue center. Patricia, who had approached each day with quiet determination to make amends through actions rather than words. "I am willing to forgive," she said finally. "Not because the hurt wasn't real, and not because what you did was acceptable, but because carrying that anger for 50 years hasn't made my life better. It's time to let it go." Pierce nodded and turned to Rebecca. "Mrs. Hayes, Are you prepared to accept responsibility for your actions 50 years ago without excuse or justification? Are you willing to acknowledge that you failed in your duty to family and to commit to being better going forward? Rebecca's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the tears that began streaming down her cheeks. Yes, I failed Lila when she needed me most, and I've failed my own children by teaching them that love is conditional. I want to do better, but I don't know if I'm strong enough to change patterns I've followed my entire life. Honesty is a beginning, Pierce replied, then turned to Thomas. Mr. Morrison, the same question. Are you prepared to accept full responsibility for your failures, and to use whatever time you have left to demonstrate the kind of character you should have shown 50 years ago? I am, Thomas said simply. I was a coward then, and I've been a coward for 50 years since. I can't undo the damage I've done, but I can stop adding to it. Finally, Pierce addressed Patricia. Mrs. Hendricks, your response? Patricia wiped her eyes with a tissue she'd been clutching throughout the proceedings. I've been carrying guilt and shame for half a century, and it's nearly killed me. I want to put that burden down, but only if I've earned the right to do so. I want to spend whatever years I have left proving that I can be the kind of person my mother raised me to be, instead of the selfish woman I became. Pierce nodded solemnly, then broke the wax seal on the envelope. Inside was another letter in Margaret Morrison's handwriting, along with a second set of legal documents that appeared far more extensive than anything they'd seen before. Before I read this aloud, Pierce said, I should mention that your answers have been recorded as per your grandmother's instructions. She wanted there to be no question about the sincerity of your commitments. He unfolded the letter and began to read. My dearest family, if you are hearing these words, then you have successfully completed the first stage of what I hope will be a long journey toward healing the wounds we've all inflicted on each other. But the $13 million you've been discussing for the past month was never the real inheritance. Rebecca gasped. What does that mean? Pierce continued reading. The $13 million was a test, a way to bring you together and force you to confront the choices you made 50 years ago. But over the past 5 decades, through careful investment and the power of compound interest, that initial sum has grown considerably. The actual value of the estate, as of the date this letter was written, is approximately $50 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rescue center's usual background sounds seemed to have been swallowed by the magnitude of the revelation. 50 million, Thomas whispered. But, Pierce continued reading, the money comes with conditions that cannot be negotiated or circumvented. The inheritance can only be used to establish a foundation dedicated to animal welfare and family reconciliation. Lila will serve as the foundation's director, with each family member receiving a position and salary commensurate with their skills and contributions. Rebecca leaned forward. What kind of salary? Each family member will receive enough to solve their current financial difficulties and provide comfortable but not extravagant living. Rebecca's husband's medical treatments will be fully funded. Thomas's ranch will be saved from foreclosure and his own medical care provided. Patricia's debts will be cleared and her retirement secured. But none of you will become wealthy in the traditional sense. Instead, you will become stewards of resources dedicated to healing, both for animals in need and for families torn apart by selfishness and pride. Pierce set down the letter and withdrew a thick stack of legal documents from the envelope. The foundation has already been established, with your grandmother as the primary benefactor and Lila as the designated director. These documents outline the structure, governance, and operational requirements. What if we don't agree to the conditions? Rebecca asked. Pierce consulted another page of the letter. If any family member chooses not to participate in the foundation, they will receive a one-time payment of $50,000 and forfeit any further claim to the estate. The foundation will proceed with the remaining participants, and the refusing party will be considered to have chosen money over family once again. The weight of the choice settled over them like a blanket. $50 million. enough to solve all their problems and fund a mission that could help thousands of animals and families. But it meant committing to work together, to rebuild relationships that had been broken for 50 years, to prove that they had truly learned from their failures. "There's one more thing," Pierce added, consulting the final page of the letter. "The Foundation must operate for a minimum of 10 years before any participant can withdraw. This is not a quick fix for your financial problems. It's commitment to building something lasting. Something that honors the best parts of who we all could have been." Patricia was the first to speak. 10 years of working together. 10 years of proving we've changed. Can we do that? Can we really become the kind of people this opportunity requires? Thomas looked around the rescue center that Lila had built from nothing, at the animals who had found safety and healing under her care. "She did it," he said simply. "She took the worst thing that could happen to a child and turned it into something beautiful. Maybe she can teach us how to do the same thing with our mistakes." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, clearly calculating the implications of the choice before her. Finally, she looked directly at Lila. "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. If we do this, if we commit to this foundation and working together, will you be able to trust us? Or will we spend 10 years having every decision questioned because of what we did 50 years ago?" It was a fair question, and Lila considered it carefully. "Trust is earned through consistent actions over time," she said finally. "I'm willing to give you the chance to earn it, but I won't pretend that it will happen overnight. We'll all have to prove ourselves every day, through the choices we make and the way we treat each other and the animals we're trying to help." Pierce gathered the documents and placed them on the porch table. "You have 48 hours to make your decision. If you choose to participate, you'll need to sign these agreements and commit to the Foundation's mission and governance structure. If not, the $50,000 payments will be arranged within a week," as the lawyer drove away, leaving them alone with the most significant decision any of them would ever make. The 4 Morrison family members sat in silence, each contemplating a future that had suddenly become far more complex and far more hopeful than any of them had dared to imagine. The rescue center continued its daily rhythms. Around them, animals being fed and cared for, volunteers arriving for their shifts, the endless cycle of healing and hope that Lila had built from the ashes of her childhood trauma. The question now was whether her family could learn to be part of that mission, or whether 50 years of selfishness and pride had damaged them beyond the possibility of redemption. Tomorrow, they would have to decide not just what they wanted, but who they wanted to become. And for the first time in 50 years, they would have to make that decision together. The 48 hours that followed Pierce's revelation stretched like an eternity. Each family member wrestled with the magnitude of the choice before them, not just the $50 million, but the commitment to 10 years of working together, of proving they had truly changed, of building something meaningful from the ruins of their fractured relationships. Lila found herself walking the property at all hours, seeking clarity in the familiar routines that had anchored her life for decades. The animals sensed her restlessness. Max stayed closer than usual, his cloudy eyes watching her with the wisdom of a companion who had shared every triumph and heartbreak of her adult life. Even the horses seemed more alert, gathering at their fence lines when she passed as if offering their silent support. Rebecca paced the guest room like a caged animal, her phone pressed to her ear as she had whispered conversations with her husband back in Missoula. The Foundation would fund his treatment, secure their financial future, and give her the chance to be part of something larger than herself. But it also meant admitting that her entire approach to family relationships had been fundamentally flawed. "I don't know if I can do it." "David," she whispered into the phone during one of her late-night conversations. 10 years of working with people who have every right to hate me. 10 years of proving I'm not the selfish person I've been my entire life." Her husband's response was gentle but clear. "Maybe that's exactly what you need. Maybe that's what we both need, the chance to become better people than we've been, Thomas spent his time in the barns and pastures, working with his hands while his mind processed the implications of the choice. His cancer was progressing. The doctors had given him perhaps a year to live, but the foundation would ensure that his remaining time was spent meaningfully. More importantly, it would provide for his disabled son after he was gone. He'd found particular comfort in working with Luna, the abandoned German shepherd who had been so traumatized when she'd first arrived. Under his patient care, she was beginning to trust again, allowing herself to be petted and even playing with toys for the first time since her abandonment. "We're both learning to trust again, aren't we, girl?" he murmured as he sat with her in the early morning quiet. Luna pressed against his leg in response, her tail wagging tentatively. If a damaged animal could learn to love again after abandonment, perhaps damaged people could too. Patricia threw herself into the rescue center's administrative work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She reorganized filing systems, updated databases, and created operational manuals that would make the transition to Foundation status smoother. It was her way of proving her commitment without having to voice the hopes and fears that churned in her chest. But it was during her work in the office that she made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in one of the old filing cabinets was a manila folder marked Morrison Family History, documents that Lila had apparently never found, or perhaps had never wanted to examine. Inside the folder were photographs spanning generations, including images from the day of the funeral 50 years ago. Patricia found herself staring at a picture she'd never seen before. Herself, Rebecca, and Thomas standing by their cars after loading them with their grandmother's belongings. In the background, barely visible but unmistakably there, was 8-year-old Lila watching from the porch, Max sitting loyally beside her. The photograph captured a moment Patricia had tried to forget, the exact instant when they'd made the decision to drive away without looking back. Lila's face in the photo was heartbreaking in its confused hope, as if she was still expecting someone to remember she existed. But it was the handwritten note clipped to the photograph that brought Patricia to her knees. In her mother's distinctive script, June 15, 1974, the day my family showed their true character. I pray that someday they will have the chance to show Lila who they really could be, instead of who they chose to be in their moment of testing. Patricia carried the photograph to the kitchen, where the others were gathered for what had become their nightly strategy sessions. Without a word, she placed it on the table where they all could see it. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Rebecca covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Thomas stared at the image with the expression of a man confronting his worst failure. Lila picked up the photograph gently, studying her 8-year-old self with eyes that held 50 years of accumulated wisdom and pain. "I remember this moment," she said quietly. "I remember standing on that porch, watching all of you load your cars. I kept thinking someone would remember I was there. Someone would ask what was supposed to happen to me. We all saw you," Thomas said, his voice barely audible. "We all knew what we were doing, and we did it anyway." "Why?" Lila asked, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. "I've wondered for 50 years. Why was it so easy to drive away from a child who needed you?" Rebecca wiped her eyes and looked directly at her cousin for the first time since the photograph had been revealed. "Because taking care of you would have been inconvenient. Because we were all dealing with our own grief and problems, and adding your needs to our burdens felt like too much. Because it was easier to tell ourselves that someone else would handle it, that somehow you'd be fine on your own. And because," Patricia added, her voice thick with shame, "we could. Because there was no one to hold us accountable, no consequences for our selfishness, except the guilt we'd have to carry." "Did you carry it?" Lila asked. "The guilt? Every day," Thomas replied. "Every single day for 50 years. But guilt without action is just self-pity. We wallowed in feeling bad about what we'd done, instead of finding the courage to make it right." The conversation that followed was unlike anything they'd shared during their month of tentative reconciliation. For the first time, They talked honestly about the choices they'd made, the rationalizations they'd used to justify their actions, and the ways their abandonment of Lila had shaped the people they'd become. Rebecca admitted that her pattern of conditional love had damaged her relationships with her own children, teaching them that affection was something to be earned rather than freely given. Thomas acknowledged that his cowardice in that moment had set a pattern of taking the safe path instead of the right path that had defined his entire life. Patricia revealed that her financial struggles weren't just bad luck. They were the result of decades of poor decisions made by someone who had never learned to take responsibility for consequences. "We didn't just abandon you that day," Thomas said finally. "We abandoned the best parts of ourselves. We chose selfishness over family, convenience over compassion, and we've been living with the consequences ever since." "So have I," Lila replied. "I've spent 50 years afraid to truly trust anyone, afraid to let people get close enough to hurt me the way you hurt me. I built walls around my heart that kept out not just pain, but joy. I saved hundreds of animals, but I couldn't save myself from the damage you caused." The admission hung in the air like a confession. For all her success in building the rescue center, for all the healing she'd facilitated for abandoned and abused animals, Lila had never fully healed from her own abandonment. "The foundation," Patricia said quietly, "it's not just about the money, is it? It's about the chance for all of us to finally heal, to become the people we should have been 50 years ago. But can we?" Rebecca asked. "Can people really change after living their entire lives one way? Can I learn to love unconditionally when I've spent 65 years loving with conditions? Can Thomas learn to be brave when he spent 73 years choosing the safe path? Can I learn to trust when I've spent 50 years building walls?" Lila added, "The questions had no easy answers. Change was possible, but it required more than good intentions. It required daily choices, consistent actions, and the kind of courage that none of them had shown during their moment of testing 50 years ago." Dr. Sarah Chen arrived for her evening rounds to find the 4 family members still gathered around the kitchen table. The photograph between them like evidence in a trial that had no jury except their own consciences. "You all look like you've been wrestling with angels," she observed, setting down her medical bag. "Wrestling with demons, more likely," Thomas replied. Sarah studied their faces, the tear-stained makeup, the exhausted expressions, the way they were all leaning slightly toward each other as if drawn together by shared gravity. "Maybe that's the same thing," she said thoughtfully. "Maybe wrestling with our demons is how we find our angels." Mike Torres joined them shortly after, having finished the evening feeding rounds. He took one look at the group and immediately understood that something significant was happening. "The foundation decision?" he asked simply. Lila nodded. "We have to decide by tomorrow." All of us together. Mike settled into the remaining chair, his weathered hands folded on the table. "Mind if I share something? I've been watching all of you for the past month, and I've seen something that maybe you haven't noticed yourselves." He gestured toward the window, where the rescue center was settling into its evening rhythms. "See those animals out there? Most of them came here broken, traumatized, afraid to trust. But they healed, not because we erased what happened to them, but because we gave them safety and consistency and the time to remember how to love." His eyes moved to each family member in turn. "You're all doing the same thing those animals did when they first arrived. You're circling each other warily, testing to see if it's safe to hope, wondering if you can risk trusting again after being hurt so badly." "And your point is?" Rebecca asked. "My point is that healing is possible, but it takes time and patience and the willingness to be vulnerable, even when you're scared. You've all been hurt by each other, and you've all done damage that can't be undone. But that doesn't mean you can't build something better going forward." As the evening wore on, the conversation gradually shifted from recriminations about the past to possibilities for the future. What would the foundation look like? How would they structure their working relationships? What safeguards would they need to prevent old patterns from reasserting themselves? But underneath the practical planning was a more fundamental question. Did they believe, truly believe, that people could change? Did they have the courage to bet 10 years of their lives on the possibility that love could triumph over 50 years of hurt and disappointment? The answer, Lila realized as she watched her family members debate foundation bylaws and governance structures, wasn't about them at all. It was about her. They had made their choices 50 years ago, lived with the consequences, and now were asking for forgiveness they didn't deserve. But her choice to grant that forgiveness, to trust them with her future, to risk her heart on the possibility of healing, that choice was entirely her own. As the clock approached midnight, marking less than 24 hours until their deadline, Lila stood and walked to her grandmother's rocking chair. She settled into the familiar curves of the old wood, feeling the presence of the woman who had orchestrated this entire reconciliation from beyond the grave. "What would you do, grandmother?" she whispered into the quiet night air. "If you were me, what choice would you make?" The answer came not in words, but in memories, flashes of her grandmother's patient teaching, her unconditional love, her belief that people were capable of becoming better than they were. Margaret Morrison had spent 50 years protecting her granddaughter from a distance, believing that someday the family would return and Lila would have to choose between bitterness and grace. "I've made my decision," Lila announced, her voice carrying clearly through the kitchen. "But before I tell you what it is, I need each of you to make a promise. Not to me, but to yourselves." She looked at Rebecca first. "I need you to promise that you'll learn to love without conditions, starting with your own children. That you'll stop using emotions as tools to manipulate people into giving you what you want." Rebecca nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I promise to try. I promise to get help learning how to love the way I should have learned 50 years ago." "Thomas." Lila's gaze moved to her uncle. "I need you to promise that you'll use whatever time you have left to demonstrate courage instead of fear. That you'll make the hard choices instead of the safe ones." "I promise," Thomas said simply. "I promise to die better than I've lived." "And Patricia," Lila looked at her aunt with eyes that held both compassion and steel, "I need you to promise that you'll stop using guilt and shame as excuses for inaction. That you'll channel your regret into positive change instead of self-pity." Patricia straightened in her chair, something shifting in her expression from defeated to determined. "I promise to make amends through actions, not just words." "Then here's my decision," Lila said, standing and moving to the kitchen table where the foundation documents waited. "I'm signing these papers, not because you deserve forgiveness, but because I deserve peace. Not because I trust you completely, but because I choose to trust in the possibility that people can change if they're given the chance." She picked up a pen and signed her name with firm, clear strokes. "I'm betting the next 10 years of my life on the hope that my grandmother was right, that love really can triumph over hurt, that families really can heal, and that sometimes the people who wound us the deepest can become the ones who help us grow the strongest." One by one, the others joined her at the table. Rebecca signed with shaking hands, her signature blotted by tears. Thomas signed with the deliberate care of a man who understood this might be the most important document he'd ever put his name to. Patricia signed with the firm strokes of someone who had finally found a way to turn decades of regret into purposeful action. As the last signature dried on the page, the Morrison family became something they hadn't been in 50 years, truly united in a common purpose. Not because they'd forgotten the past or erased their mistakes, but because they'd chosen to build something better from the pieces of what had been broken. Outside, the rescue center slept peacefully under the Montana stars. Animals who had been abandoned, abused, and traumatized rested safely in their enclosures, living proof that healing was possible even after the worst kinds of damage. Tomorrow, those same principles of patience, consistency, and unconditional care would be applied not just to wounded animals, but to a wounded family learning to love each other again. The foundation they were creating would serve both missions, healing animals and healing the human relationships that had been damaged by selfishness, pride, and the fundamental failure to understand what love really meant. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be setbacks, arguments, and moments when 50 years of accumulated hurt threatened to overwhelm their fragile new beginning. But for the first time in half a century, the Morrison family faced the future together, united not by blood or obligation, but by choice. They had chosen forgiveness over bitterness, hope over hurt, and the difficult path of growth over the easier path of giving up. As Lila settled back into her grandmother's rocking chair, Max curled up at her feet as he had done thousands of times before. She felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the peace that comes from being part of a family that chooses to stay, even when staying is hard. 6 months later, the Morrison Family Foundation had become something none of them could have imagined when they'd first signed those documents with such uncertainty and hope. The wildfire rescue effort had not only succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, but had transformed their small rescue center into a regional model for emergency animal response. Rebecca had made her choice with surprising clarity. She'd negotiated with her husband's medical team to delay the experimental treatment by 3 months, using that time to establish a satellite office of the foundation in California. Her husband would receive his treatment, but Rebecca would continue her work, coordinating West Coast rescue efforts, proving that sometimes love means finding creative solutions rather than making impossible either-or decisions. Thomas had chosen to decline the clinical trial, but not out of despair. Instead, he'd used his remaining time to create a comprehensive training program for working with traumatized animals, documenting techniques and insights that would help future volunteers long after he was gone. His decision to stay had allowed him to shepherd 17 of the wildfire animals through successful rehabilitation and placement in permanent homes. Patricia had found a way to honor both commitments by bringing her stroke-recovering mother to Montana, where the older woman had surprised everyone by becoming one of the foundation's most dedicated volunteers. Their reconciliation had been rocky and sometimes painful, but it had been real in a way that superficial family obligations never could be. The latest arrival at the rescue center was a 6-month-old German Shepherd puppy named Hope, abandoned at a gas station with nothing but a cardboard sign that read, "Please love me." She bore no resemblance to Max except in species, but watching her play in the same yard where Max had spent his final months, Lila felt the circle of healing beginning to close. "She's going to be a handful," Dr. Sarah Chen observed, watching as Hope enthusiastically destroyed a rope toy while 3 elderly cats watched with patient resignation. "The best ones always are," Lila replied, remembering another German Shepherd puppy who'd been left behind 50 years ago. Confused and frightened, but somehow managing to grow into the most loyal companion she'd ever known. The foundation's success had attracted national attention, but more importantly, it had proven that the principles they'd learned from Max, consistency, patience, unconditional care, could heal not just individual animals, but entire communities of damaged souls. They'd helped reunite dozens of families with their lost pets, provided temporary housing for animals whose owners were in crisis, and created support networks for people struggling to care for beloved companions during difficult times. But perhaps the most significant measure of their success was visible in the framed photograph that now sat on the kitchen table, a new family portrait taken just last week. The 4 Morrison family members stood together in front of the main barn, surrounded by some of their success stories. Horses who had learned to trust again, dogs who had overcome abuse, cats who had found safety after abandonment. Unlike the childhood drawing that Patricia had preserved for 47 years, this photograph showed people who were connected not by naive hope, but by hard-won understanding of what family actually meant. They weren't holding hands in the picture, but they didn't need to. Their unity was evident in the way they leaned slightly toward each other, in the genuine smiles that reached their eyes. in the shared pride they took in the mission they'd built together. Thomas had passed away 3 weeks earlier, peacefully in his sleep after spending his final evening sitting with Luna, the abandoned German shepherd who had finally learned to trust again under his patient care. His funeral had been held on the hill overlooking the rescue center, and his grave now rested beside Max's under a simple stone that read, "He learned to stay." His death had been heartbreaking, but not devastating. The foundation continued its work, and the programs he'd developed continued to help traumatized animals find healing. More importantly, his choice to spend his final months proving that people could change had inspired dozens of volunteers to deepen their own commitments to the Foundation's mission. "I think Grandmother would be proud," Lila said, settling into the rocking chair that had become the Foundation's informal headquarters. Hope immediately claimed her lap, a warm and wiggling reminder that new beginnings were always possible. "I think she knew," Patricia replied from her spot at the kitchen table, where she was reviewing applications for their new scholarship program for veterinary students from low-income families. "I think she knew we'd eventually find our way back to each other, even if it took 50 years and a small fortune to make it happen," Rebecca laughed, a sound that had become genuinely warm over the months of working together. A small fortune and the most loyal dog in the history of the world. "Don't forget Max's contribution to this family reconciliation." The conversation continued as the sun set over the Montana landscape, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that rivaled any masterpiece. Outside, the evening shift of volunteers was completing their rounds, checking on animals whose own journeys from trauma to healing mirrored the human transformations that had made the Foundation possible. In the distance, Hope's excited barking announced the arrival of a potential adopter coming to meet one of their success stories. A border collie mix who had arrived 6 months earlier, terrified and shut down, but who had blossomed into a confident, loving companion under the patient care of people who understood that healing takes time. These moments of successful placement never lost their magic. Each adoption represented not just a happy ending for an individual animal, but proof that the principles they'd learned from rebuilding their own family relationships, patience, consistency, unconditional love, could create miracles when applied with genuine commitment. As the last light faded from the western sky, Lila Morrison looked around at the life she'd built from the ashes of childhood abandonment, now enhanced and expanded by the very people who had once been the source of her deepest pain. The rescue center hummed with the quiet activity of hundreds of creatures finding safety, healing, and hope in a place that had been created by someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be left behind. The Morrison family had learned what Max had always known, that love isn't about never failing, but about choosing to stay even after you've failed. It's about showing up consistently, caring unconditionally, and believing that healing is always possible if you're patient enough to let it unfold in its own time. Some families are born from blood and circumstances beyond anyone's control. But the best families, Lila had discovered, are chosen daily through small acts of loyalty, large gestures of sacrifice, and the ongoing decision to see the best in each other, even when that best is sometimes hard to find. The Morrison Family Foundation would continue its work long after all of them were gone, a living testament to the possibility that people can change, that love can triumph over hurt, and that sometimes the most beautiful things in life grow from the darkest soil. In the end, they had proven that family isn't about being perfect. It's about being present, especially when presence is difficult. And in the quiet evening air, with Hope sleeping peacefully in her lap and her family working contentedly around her, Lila Morrison finally understood what her grandmother had been trying to teach them all along, that the greatest inheritance isn't money or property or even love itself, but the wisdom to recognize that love is a choice, made new each day, and powerful enough to heal even the deepest wounds if we have the courage to let it.